Well, good afternoon, everybody. It looks like we're having most people join right now. We're here at 3 o'clock, so I just wanted to welcome everybody to the meeting. So we are here for a special meeting of the two Turlock Subbasin Technical Advisory Committees. And just a couple reminders here, if you're on a phone line like I am right now, you can use *6 to toggle mute and unmute, or you could do *9 to raise and lower your hand and let the host know that you're wishing to speak or you have a problem. Please mute and unmute regardless, whether you're on Zoom or your phone accordingly. And then we'll have public comment as we do always. And then we are recording the meeting, and that'll be available online sometime in the next day or two after this meeting. And the meeting materials from today and the presentation from the consulting team will be up shortly after this meeting. I'll get that up. And so with that being said, I will now hand the meeting over to those who are going to run it, and I'll pull up the agenda.
Yes, thank you, Herb, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Cook. I'm with Turlock Irrigation District. I'm the coordinator for the West Turlock Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Agency. And this is a joint meeting we run with our counterparts in the East Turlock Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Agency, and Sarah Wolf as the chair of that group, and she's helped me run the meeting today. So without any further ado, I'll call the West Turlock Subbasin group to order. We need 7 members for a quorum, and right now I see Karen from City of Ceres, Ward from Stanislaus County, Debbie Montalbano from Turlock Irrigation District, Richard Lindo from Daenerys CSD, Carl Brown from the City of Turlock, Lacey McBride from Merced County, and Curtis with Hillmark County Water District. That's 7 people. Have I missed anybody from the West Turlock GSA?
Michael, this is Miguel with City Modesto.
Thank you, Miguel.
And Michael, this is Mike with the City Waterproof.
Wonderful. So we have Miguel Alvarez and Mike Pidcock with City of Waterford representing Houston. So with that, we have 9 members today, and at 3:02, I call the West Turlock Subbasin Technical Advisory Committee to order. So I hand over to you now, Sarah.
Thank you, Michael. For the East Turlock, we need 3 representatives, and I believe Walt Ward, Lacey McBride, and Matt Beeman are on the call. Did I miss anyone else from the East Turlock? So with that, we have a quorum, and we can call the East Turlock to order, and it's 3:03 at the same time. Michael.
Thank you, Sarah. So moving on to item number 3, public participation. This is the time set aside for members of the public to directly address the Technical Advisory Committee on any item of interest to the public that was within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Technical Advisory Committee. You can speak about anything right now, or if you want to speak about something that's on the agenda, you can hold your comments till then. It's up to you. So with that, do we have any public participation?
Yes, this is Rhett Calkins.
Go ahead, Rhett.
I sent a couple emails to Turlock Groundwater on September 17th, and Michael Cook, you answered one of them, and I appreciate that. That was a good response. The other one was with regards to the Ceres regulating reservoir and the amount of water as a project with respect to the groundwater that the Turlock groundwater consultants said would be contributed by percolation, and they attributed 400 acre feet per year via percolation from the Ceres regulating reservoir that TID will put in. But TID, in their presentation at the board, said that would be a fiber reinforced concrete lined, and they did look at the possibility of having it percolate, but the nature of the soils would not allow that to happen, would cause problems. So the decision was to have it fiber reinforced. So it would just be regulating reservoir without the additional benefit of percolation. So my question what revolved around that in the email was, well, what are we doing in series with that? We have two opposing proposals that are happening with that regulating reservoir. That was my question.
Michael, this is Debbie. I could try to answer that if you want to do that, or I could reach out to Red separately.
Yeah, just real quickly, Debbie, and then
Yeah.
you can hear it.
So I contacted just to, and I'm sorry I didn't get back to you directly, Red. I thought we had followed up with you. The 400 or the recharge that is proposed as a part of the project is taking into consideration the concrete lining. It's not, you're going to have some seepage even with a lined system, not as much as you would have otherwise, but you're going to have water in this facility on an ongoing basis. And so there's going to be some seepage that comes out of it anyway. And that was the amount that they estimated. And over time, we may see something different and we can make adjustments to that, but that was the number that was actually included in the CEQA documents. And so we followed that into the analysis. So I hope that helps.
That helps. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Debbie. Appreciate the question. Red, we have another question. Herb, I thought you had somebody on to.
Breck Rosenkrantz wanted to make a comment. He had a chat.
Go ahead, Breck.
Hi, thanks very much. I just wanted to mention that I was sending in comments on chapter 5 and reviewing the previous chapters and noted that the city of San Francisco and its very large share of water rights in the Tuolumne Basin is not even mentioned in your documents. And here's a city water user that has these water rights. They don't use most of them. They store a lot of water because they worry about their weak water rights in dry years. They have very deep pockets that could pay for groundwater recharge. And I just see no evidence that you folks are reaching out and trying to work with them. And I've been in this business for 30 years, California Water. I understand that there's cultural, political friction between rural communities and cities and so forth. But I just think that without considering, how you might be able to work cooperatively on conjunctive use with San Francisco, that everybody will lose, that there are really good opportunities out there and you ought to strongly consider it. Thanks.
Thank you, Brett. That's a great comment. We do obviously meet fairly regularly with the city and county of San Francisco, and certainly something I could raise with them, but something we hadn't considered before because right now we don't have access to the water in our subbasin. But that's a good point. I'll be happy to follow up on that one. Okay, do we have any other questions for public participation?
Yeah, I have a question. Joseph Gallegos.
Yeah, go ahead, sir.
So at the last meeting, there was a question about how many acres that we need to divide the shortages from, or the sustainable use deduction. I never got that number of how many total acres are we applying towards the agricultural acres across both basins.
Okay. And I don't know if that's something that's going to come up in our presentations that follow later on in the meeting here. We talk about demand management modeling results and other Sigma updates. But it is an outstanding question, Joseph, and we will follow up to make sure that gets answered either today or some other time. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah, it's okay. Just as long as somebody puts on their notebook that they're going to follow up with me. I know at the last one we reviewed chapter 5, they were supposed to get back, but it was over some time ago.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much. All right. Anything else for public participation? Okay. Hearing or seeing none, We'll move to item number 4. So 4 and 5 are kind of a little bit unusual, I know, for this, and it's relating to the pandemic. So 4 would be a resolution of the West Turlock Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Technical Advisory Committee, recognizing the state of emergency proclaimed by the governor on March 4th, 2020, which remains in effect, and authorizing remote teleconference meetings of our Technical Advisory Committee for a period of October 4th through November 3rd, 2021. So let me just explain to the public what's happening here. So the original legislation allowed teleconferencing because of the pandemic, with kind of the changing situation in California. An assembly bill was passed, AB 361, that went into effect on September 16th, 2021, that allows us to continue to hold public meetings via teleconferencing, as long as we have a continued statewide state of emergency, which we do. And so as we kind of wean ourselves back to normality, we can only adopt these resolutions on a 30-day basis. So we can continue to recognize the governor's state of emergency, and that will allow us to continue meeting via teleconference. So we met a week or so ago to talk about this. It was felt that over the next 6 or 7 weeks is a lot of work that the Technical Advisory Committee has to do, and needs public input. And so far, it seems that the teleconference meetings are going well. It allows us to get a quorum, allows us to get good public feedback. So rather than going to in-person meetings, we take advantage of a provision in AB 361 that allows us to continue to do our work via teleconference and maintain public participation. So that's basically it. So we've followed provisions of the law. It's been reviewed by our attorneys. We have to adopt a resolution allowing us to continue meeting via teleconference due to the state of emergency. And again, these resolutions are good for 30 days. So basically, on a go-forward basis, once a month, we'd adopt a similar resolution to allow us to continue meeting via teleconference, unless the majority of the group wants to go back to in-person meetings. Obviously, then we would not adopt this resolution. So hopefully that makes sense. And any questions by members of the Technical Advisory Committee about what the resolution is for and why we need to do it? Are there any concerns with continuing to meet via teleconference? I must admit, we do get a very good turnout with our teleconference meetings. And I'd be loath to go back to in-person meetings right now and not get this type of participation, which we obviously need at this critical time. Any questions from the public about this resolution?
You need a motion, Michael?
Yeah, I need a motion and a second. And because it's a resolution, we haven't done this ever, I don't think. We do have to afterwards have a roll call vote. So be ready. We have a motion, second, and I'll ask Jennifer to call the roll for the West Turlock. So be ready with your mute and unmute buttons. So go ahead.
So moved.
Okay, so we're adopting a resolution, the West Turlock TAC, recognizing the state of emergency proclaimed by the governor on March 4th, 2021, which remains in effect, and authorizing remote teleconference meetings at the West Turlock TAC for a period of October 4th through November 3rd, pursuant to the. So we have a motion from Curtis from Hillmore County Water District. Do we have a second?
I'll second. This is Debbie.
Debbie from Turlock Irrigation District. Any more discussion? Okay, hearing none with that, Jennifer, could you call the roll, please?
Thank you, Chair Cook. Member Alvarez?
Yes.
Member Brown?
Yes.
Member Juritzma?
Yes.
Member Lindo?
Yes.
Member Maldonado?
Yes.
Member McBride?
Yes.
Member Montalbano?
Yes.
Member Pitcock? Member Pitcock? Member Ward?
Yes.
Vice Chair Morgan?
Sorry, my thing didn't work. Yes.
Thank you. And Chair Cook?
At the same time as Karen, yes.
Thank you very much. Chair Cook, your resolution has passed.
Wonderful. So moving on to number 5, a similar action for the East Turlock Technical Advisory Committee.
Yes, thank you, Michael. The East Turlock would like to pass a like resolution for the East Turlock TAC for the month of October going into November, and anticipate doing these every 30 days as well. So we'd be looking for a similar motion from the East Turlock.
So moved, Walt.
Thank you, Walt. And a second.
Second, Lacey.
Thank you, Lacey. And I'll do a roll call vote of the East Turlock. Walt Ward,
Yes.
Lacey McBride,
Yes.
Matt Beeman,
Yes.
and Sarah Wolf, yes. Motion carries and resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody. Okay, moving on to item number 6, demand management modeling results. Review and discuss the draft demand management modeling results. Again, this is not an action item. It's an update presented by Woodard and Kern. And we have Ali Tagavi and Dominic Amador with us today. So go ahead, guys.
Good afternoon, folks. This is Ali Tagavi with Woodard and Curran, and let me just start here. There we go. Appreciate the time, Chairman Cook. Today we'd like to present to you the results of the sustainable management conditions in the Turlock Subbasin that has been conducted since last TAC meeting. The agenda that we're going to follow is talk about a few minutes about the background as well as summary of the findings, and then we'll dive right into the details of the sustainability analysis, and we'll talk also about what the next steps are going to be. As you all know by now, we have developed an integrated water resources model for the Turlock Subbasin, and the model represents the physical condition based on significant amount of data and information on hydrology, hydrogeologic conditions, land use, water supply, and water use conditions and the operations. The model pretty much basically uses mathematical formulation for each one of the various pieces of the hydrologic and the water supply conditions. So this, diagram here represents in fairly detail what all the different components are. And I want to emphasize that this is a very, very complex, yet fairly reasonable and accurate representation of the subbasin, given the data and information that's been available to us. The model has been calibrated. I've got plenty of stuff on this slide here, but primarily it's trying to tell you that we spent over 9 months basically developing this model and calibrating this in a fairly open and transparent environment. Technical consultants, various staff members, management were involved in development and calibration of the model, reviewing the data sets for the model and assumptions that's gone into the model, as well as the results of the calibration. So the model represents the groundwater budget components and land and water use components. We've presented box diagram of the water budgets to you folks before. The model kind of looks at the stream flow conditions in the Tuolumne River, as well as the Merced River and San Joaquin, and also is calibrated to groundwater levels, observed groundwater levels over time, both in terms of the seasonal fluctuations as well as long-term trends. And so to that end, then, the model is fairly reasonable representation and provides a fairly good representation of this physical system based on the data and the mathematical formulations. the Turlock and the Modesto model, and the reason we call it Turlock Modesto, because those were basically moved forward together. And so we kept the interface between the Turlock and Modesto fairly fluid in order to make sure that both Turlock and Modesto are properly represented within the context of the overall model development, the physical conditions, the data and information that's gone into the model. So this model represents, reasonable basin-wide as well as GSA level conditions for the water budgets, I would say. It represents reasonably well the groundwater levels and the groundwater flow conditions and interaction between the groundwater and the surface water system to the extent that data has been available to us. So as we move towards the east, all the way to the eastern part of the basin, not quite the East Side Water District, but even further through, closer to the foothills, there's a whole lot less data that's been available, both in terms of the water use as well as groundwater levels. So the level of calibration, of course, starts fading, but overall, we believe that the model is the best scientific tool at this stage, based on the latest information to represent the basin historically, as well as the predictions in the model. So the last bullet talks about model providing reasonable predictions in terms of changes in groundwater levels as a result of a project implementation, whether that's water supply project or a demand side project. The model is reasonably well representing those changes as a result of implementation of these projects. By no means we think that the model would give us absolute groundwater levels or absolute, stream flow conditions, but everything is in relative terms relative to what we call a baseline condition. So to that end, I want to kind of touch on certain type of uncertainties that are typically in a modeling exercise and modeling analysis. A model's got uncertainties with respect to theoretical concepts that are formulated and the development of a code and solution technique that ends up representing the physical system. So there's uncertainties there, not only in terms of formulation, but also in terms of the spatial resolution and temporal resolution of the model and the data. To that end, lots of uncertainty in terms of much of the data that we have. But we also have very good information on the reservoir operations, on the stream flows, relatively good information, I would say, on the geology and the hydrogeology of the basin. The observations, like I said, the observed groundwater level data changes the quality from one place to the other and one part to the other. So all of that plays a role in terms of uncertainties that go into the model, which eventually feeds into how we calibrate the model and what sort of data we have to calibrate the model. And eventually, when we look 50 years into the future per what Sigma is requiring us, there's a lot of uncertainties in terms of land and water use conditions, population trends, development trends, even cropping patterns. Who knows what's happening, in 20 or 25 years down the road. And of course, climatic conditions are also driving our projection uncertainties. So with all of that in mind, we've made assumptions. And based on those assumptions, we are making simulations and we are making analysis using the model as the best analytical tool, which I believe most of the technical staff members and consultants who have been working throughout the basin, we all have kind of fairly good consensus on the quality of the results of the model. So what can we use the model for? It can assist us in understanding the basin operations and sensitivities of the basin to the various forces, including human actions, as well as natural forces and natural components, whether that's hydrology, rainfall, stream flow, runoff, recharge, and so on and so forth, as well as helping us how to set minimum thresholds and measurable objectives in the context of the Sigma and the GSP implementation. The model can be used to assess benefits and impacts of the changes. Like I said, everything with respect to the changes in the basin, that will be changes in the land use, water use, cropping patterns, urban demand, ag demand, and implementation of the water supply project. And that's what we're using the model for right now. So far, we've presented to you folks the results of the water supply projects, and we'll touch on that. But then today, we're going to be talking about what demand management actions are. In order to assess these water supply projects, what Sigma calls projects and management actions, we need to be looking at indicators that help us understand the basin health and basin conditions under these 6, so to speak, Sigma sustainability indicators. There are 4 of these that are designated in bold, and these 4 have been incorporated into the model in order to understand the indicators. Of course, the seawater intrusion doesn't apply to our basin, and degradation of the groundwater quality is also not assessed using the model, because the model is not set up right now to do water quality simulation, whether that's TDS, nitrates, or other components, but we are evaluating those as a surrogate using the model results. This table here shows the projects that have been conceptualized. Many of them have been defined in fairly good detail. The first 4 are urban and municipal projects. Of course, the regional water supply project by the county, that's moving forward, already under construction. And then Waterford and Hickman surface water supply, Diane storm project by City of Turlock and TID. And then the Stanislaus State stormwater recharge. Those 4 have been evaluated. We've presented the results to you folks and the benefits that these projects bring to the basin. There's also been 3 projects on behalf of each GSA on the west side and the east side that have been put forth and defined and quantified to the extent that information have been available. And so all of those have also been incorporated as what we call scenarios, and we've evaluated the benefits of these projects to the basin, presented all of that. Number 11 there is demand management. So with implementing all of these 10 projects, we still are not at a point to call the basin in a sustainable condition. And so the last piece that we have right now, which is going to be presented in a few minutes to you folks, is the demand reduction and demand management on behalf of the and so here's the sort of the findings in general as far as what we've implemented so far. The water supply projects that have been put forth by both the west side and the east side have significant benefits, of course, no doubt about it. They bring the water levels higher. They help throughout the basin, what the groundwater levels look like. They help the storage in the groundwater system, but also they bring groundwater levels to some extent higher, so we can reduce the impacts on the surface water courses, Tuolumne and Merced. But not quite yet. There still needs to be additional both water supply projects as well as demand management in order to bring the basin into sustainability. Based on all of the analysis that's been done to date, what we've concluded is that there's approximately 25% reduction in net groundwater demand on the east side is needed in order to make sure that we hit 3 points: subbasin groundwater levels, subbasin groundwater storage, as well as the interconnected surface water system, meaning minimizing the impacts on the Merced River in specific. So that 25% is based on the data, information, and analysis we've done to date. Of course, that can all be refined as we gain more knowledge, get more information through the monitoring network over the next few years, and eventually refine the analysis. So the net groundwater demand is maybe partially met through additional supplies if there are additional projects that can be put forth beyond what I presented to you earlier. To bring the basin into sustainability. So to that end, we need to evaluate sustainability condition. Of course, it's based on the best available information and data that we have. And the assumptions are to develop the GSP that supports a policy as defined by the subbasin, of course, and uncertainties, like I said, in several realms. Everything is based on the latest and best available science and best available data. What's key is implementation of these, both supply side and the demand side projects are based on adaptive management. So we modify and we refine our course as we get more knowledge and more data and more information on the intricacies of the basin, both in terms of groundwater levels, in terms of stream flows, and their interconnection. So it's an adaptive management process, and future steps are going to be potentially to define more water supply projects, learn as we go, like I said, adaptive management, assess variabilities in the hydrologic conditions, and also include potential future changes to local and state regulatory environment and policies. So with that in mind, I'm just going to take a quick pause and see if there are any potential questions, comments, thoughts on what I talked about so far, and then we'll dive into the details of how we have arrived at some of these conclusions and findings. Looks like there's no additional thoughts and comments. I'm glad everything hopefully was clear. So I'm going to pull over to the side and switch drivers and ask my colleague to sit in the driver's seat, Dominic Ambrose. Please go ahead, Dominic.
Thanks, Ali. Oops. Wrong one. There we go. There, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for Ali for getting us started. In order to dive right into the details, well, right before we do that, I want to take a second to kind of bring everybody up to speed for anybody who hasn't quite had the opportunity to attend all of the most recent TAC meetings. I'd like to kind of go over where we are in this process. I think Ali had a great summary of some of the findings, but I'd like to kind of go over some of the details of those findings with you if I can. So to kind of kick it off, today is going to be a presentation as to the results of what we're considering scenario 5. Now, scenario 5 is the culmination of several other scenarios, several other, the simulation of various projects. So to this date, we've kind of gone through scenario 1 originally was looking at urban, there are some urban and municipal projects that we had. And then we looked at 2, 3, and 4, which is kind of the culmination, the building upon that to look at what are the supply side projects that we had. So we have a set of projects from both sides, from the west and the eastern GSAs. And then we looked at some of the results and looked at what are kind of our sustainability conditions under each of these projects, with each of these projects in place, kind of effectively came to the conclusion that demand reduction was still necessary. And so because of that, we're going to take a couple steps into looking at really what level of demand reduction is necessary to bring the basin into sustainable conditions. But before we go into that, to bring you kind of up to speed as far as what are the active projects in scenarios 1, 2, 3, and 4, effectively the group of all of our, the combination of all of our supply side projects is effectively looking at about 10,000 acre feet of direct recharge and about 23,000 acre feet of in lieu recharge. Now this is the, without kind of going into the details of each of these specifically, if anyone is interested, we do have all of our recorded previous presentations. I encourage you to kind of go through there. I go through all the details as far as the assumptions and the input data and their effects on the basin as a whole. But effectively, you can see here that we're looking at about 33,000 acre feet of overall supply side projects that were implemented prior to taking the step forward of looking at demand management as a form of sustainability. So when it comes to kind of combining our supply side projects with demand management, effectively what we're going to do is take a dive into really who is the greatest what users within the basin are going to be impacted by this demand management scenario. So similar to the prior event that we went through this, when we went through this with the sustainable yield, which is basically this analysis but done prior to the projects, we separated out the basin into two predominant groups. Group one being both our surface and groundwater users. So this is going to be Turlock, Merced irrigation districts, as well as several riparian surface water users. Those, considering they are surface and groundwater users, and they are predominantly surface water, utilize surface water to meet demand, that they did not necessarily need to be subject to the next stage, which is demand management. Now, group two, which is our groundwater only users, are each of the major municipalities and communities, as well as Eastside Water District, Blico Cortez, and some of the non-district agriculture that we have within the basin. And so effectively, each of these users are going to be subject to demand management, and some of these users are actually going to be able to supplement their use by some of the projects that we have, and so they are effectively being their groundwater use is being reduced, and then they're supplementing that with some of the new surface water, new project supplies that we have, whereas others will be subject to just reducing demand without having that additional supply being met. So now that we kind of have an idea of really what goes into this model or what goes into this simulation, we're going to take a look at some of the modeling results. Now, the first step, before we actually look at the model results specifically, is going to be, well, really, what is our criterion for understanding whether or not we are in sustainability or not? So today, part of today's presentation, I'm actually going to dive into and kind of separate the presentation into three groups. First, looking at each of the sustainable management criteria, looking first at criteria number 6, which is the depletions of interconnected surface water. So for anybody that's effectively new to some of these presentations, effectively we have set minimum thresholds. So this is looking at groundwater levels adjacent to some of this, the major rivers within the basin. So the Merced, the Tuolumne, and the San Joaquin. And effectively, in order to protect the interconnected surface water system of these rivers, we have set minimum groundwater levels at along each of these rivers. The Merced River being set at spring 2014 water levels, and the San Joaquin and Tuolumne being set at the fall 2015 as far as minimum thresholds. Now, in order to be considered in compliance for Sigma, we're going to measure that by ensuring that when we do annual monitoring events, that it requires 2 consecutive events to be considered out of compliance at a given area. And then in order for the basin as a whole to be considered out of compliance, it requires greater than 50% of the wells for each of these rivers looked at independently. It requires greater than 50% of the wells to be effectively out of compliance for 2 or more consecutive years. So effectively for the Merced River, that is going to, we have 6 wells along the Merced River, requires at least 3 of those wells to be out of compliance. And similarly with the San Joaquin and Tuolumne River has 2 active wells. We're adding a 3rd shortly. And the San Joaquin River, I believe, has 3 or 4 monitoring wells as well. So you'll kind of see a combination of those as I go through the next couple slides. Oops. So to give you an idea of what the monitoring network within the basin looks like, effectively, each of kind of the colored dots we have here are effectively what we're utilizing as a minimum threshold well or within our monitoring work. So this is really where we're going to gauge whether or not or how well the basin is doing for measuring its sustainability. Now, if we want to dive in a little bit further to that, I want to kind of draw your attention to particularly these specific 6 wells. Now, the Merced River, through a lot of the analysis that we've done over the past many months, the analysis that we have done shows us that the Merced River, the minimum thresholds along the Merced River are by far the hardest to achieve. They're kind of our limiting component when it comes to achieve sustainability. So this is really where I'm going to focus, kind of at least initially draw our attention to. And then as we show what it takes to be sustainable under this, we'll check it off on the other sustainable management criteria as well. And so I'll go through each of those. But so for today, over the next 5 slides, I'm going to show you the monitoring wells and the simulation simulated groundwater levels at each of these 5 black dots. Now, we do have an additional monitoring point at this red dot here. This is actually TSS4. This well is not actually built yet. It's not in place. We don't have data for it. And so because of that, I'm kind of omitting it from this analysis, but acknowledging that as we move forward into implementation of the GSP, that is going to be an additional monitoring point along the Merced River. And so effectively, what I've done today is provided a set of hydrographs looking at several different options. And so as I kind of walk through, really give me a second to walk through what this well means and what the data that I'm providing shows at first. So initially, let's take a look at this. This is TID well 303. You can see kind of where it's located right here on the map. And effectively, there is going to be a set of 5 simulations as well as a minimum threshold. So the minimum threshold in this case for this well was set at approximately 86 feet. And you can see that's why we have this line here. And this is really, this is our target, right? Our goal is to stay kind of above that. And effectively, looking at the 5 different simulations we have the baseline, which is the projected conditions without any of the projects that we've gone through in the past. We have scenario 4, which is all of our supply side projects. And then kind of in order to kind of not overly clutter the screen, I've really kind of limited the demand reduction hydrographs that we show here at 20, 20, 25, and 30% reduction. And as Ali said, really what we're kind of the conclusion to a lot of this is that we're going to be really focusing on this 25% reduction line as kind of the result of the analysis. But I want to be able to make sure that I share with you kind of all the or some of the other options as well, so we can kind of get an idea as to the relative impacts of each of these management actions as they relate to the water levels at each of these locations. In addition to that, you'll also notice that occasionally through some of these figures, you'll see a red dot. A red dot is a fall monitoring event that occurs below the minimum threshold. So in this case, we're considering fall to be approximately in October. And what you'll notice is that, so this is saying in this one, for example, will be October in the 25th year is below the minimum threshold. And so we consider that a point where we're below the threshold, but we're not necessarily out of compliance, because out of compliance is indicative of 2 consecutive years. And so you can actually kind of see that we drop below them MT at 2 times, but since they are not consecutive years, this specific well is not out of compliance. And then finally, we note that this well is in compliance because I put a nice little green box around it, hopefully to kind of further highlight that aspect. So effectively, what we can see at this well is that the model is simulating effectively the hydrograph over time can fluctuate up and down related to hydrology, related to land use and operations. And effectively, what we have is a declining event in effectively this period here between the 20th and 25th year. This is actually going to be focused related to the hydrology, the availability of surface water. This is indicative of the 87 to 92 drought. And that's why the utilization of that hydrology, we see the impacts of that. Similarly, when it comes to the later half or the later last couple of years of the simulation, this is the most recent 2012 to 2015 drought. And so you can see the impacts of the hydrology on this well as well. And so at this well, overall, again, we have two events below the minimum threshold, but overall this well is in compliance. So as we kind of move up a little bit further upstream on the Merced River, you can kind of see here just at kind of the intersection point between the 2 GSAs, what we have is East Turlock Subbasin GSA well number 23. And effectively what we can see here is that similarly to the previous well, we see fluctuations from year to year based on hydrology, but we don't necessarily, once it comes to some of the east side wells, we don't necessarily see the large variation from year to year due to hydrology, because there's not as much surface water supply in this area. And so because of that, we don't see the large operational changes that we do sometimes in the west. Similarly to the previous well, we have 3 events below the minimum threshold, but again, they're not consecutive, so we are not out of compliance at this well as well. Now, one thing that I do want to add for this well is that you'll see here, there's a few observation points here. Now, I want to add, kind of draw your attention to this predominantly for 2 reasons. One is that this kind of gives us an idea of how well we're effectively simulating some of the operations in the fact of that this should ballpark be around where the baseline is located. Now, the reason I say ballpark is because the baseline is a projected conditions baseline. It is not a historical simulation. So because of that, the hydrology in these first 5 years or so, which would have been in theory from 2015 approximately to 2020, the hydrology is not the same. The operations are not the same because this isn't a historical simulation, but it does give us an idea of, well, how well is the model handling, the simulation at this point. The fact that we like to see it in the ballpark range of where we would see our baseline, the fact that it's not 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 feet, different from what the simulation is showing us that the model can simulate these operations at least fairly well. Similarly, again, if we move up a little bit further to what is well 17, we see kind of again very similar trends. We see that the demand reduction does improve. We see significantly higher water levels throughout the full simulation period. We see that the model is simulating this area fairly well. And again, well 17 is below the MT at this 20th year here, but for the rest of the simulation, we consider it above the MT, so we're not out of compliance. So it's another good step forward. So then in addition to that, we also have a couple wells that are actually a little bit step away from the river, because we do need to be able to control, understand the flow dynamic between both the river and the aquifer system itself. So we do grab a couple wells that are very near the river, but within a mile or two, so we can understand the gradation kind of between the two. And so when it comes to well 14, which is also, we're also utilizing a monitoring well. This is a fairly good example of a well that is the demand reduction is necessary. And so we start seeing that in some of these years, both scenario 4, which includes the projects, and the baseline itself, we're out of compliance very regularly. But once we're under demand reduction, that we don't even, in this case, we don't even come near to the minimum threshold. And so we can see that this one is within compliance in all years. And then if we move again further to the east as well, if we look at well 21, in this case, this is an event where we see both this well is regularly out of compliance, both under the baseline, under scenario 4, and under the demand reduction. And then effectively what we're utilizing, well 21, you'll see that we are both out of compliance in these 3 consecutive years here at 20, 23, 24, and 25, as well as we see 4 consecutive years here. So overall, this well is out of compliance. Now, again, I will want to add the caveat to this, that in order for the basin to be considered out of compliance, in order to really optimize our available resources, our groundwater system, is that it does take more than 1 well. In fact, it takes 3 wells to be considered out of compliance for the Merced River. And so if we want to take a look at kind of a quick summary of all that, and again, if anyone has any questions, we're happy to we can back it up and look at a couple of the previous slides again. But effectively what we have is looking at the summary slide that shows what is our kind of percent demand reduction under each of these scenarios. And we have the total pumping that under the baseline, and then effectively how much pumping is being occurred in each of these various scenarios that I have. And under kind of this pumping regime, the idea is to get an understanding of when the wells are effectively out of compliance. Finally concluding down here, and I'll get over the details in a second, but we'll come down here to the conclusion of how often are 3 or more wells below the minimum thresholds for 2 years. Because if you remember, it does take at least 3 wells to be below the minimum threshold for 2 years in order for the basin to be considered out of compliance. So overall, to go into some of the details of this slide, we can see here that under the baseline conditions, we see about 240,000 acre feet of pumping occurring in the baseline. And now this is a subset of the pumping that is related to our group 2 users. So again, this is predominantly the municipalities and the groundwater dependent areas in the eastern, predominantly in the eastern subbasin. And so the group 2 users use about 240,000 acre feet of pumping in both the baseline and in scenario 4 with, the baseline at 240,000, and then in scenario 4, we actually drop that number down to about 236,900 acre feet per year. Now this is going to be predominantly, that reduction in groundwater pumping is going to be related to some of the in-lieu recharge projects that the east and the western subbasins we outlined in the previous presentation in scenario 4. And so then based on this number, this 236,000, we actually applied the demand reduction at 20, 25, and 30% demand reduction, bringing the adjusted pumping a range of somewhere between 189 and 165,000 acre feet per year. Now, again, this is the long-term average. There is going to be variations due to hydrology and such, but overall, we're looking at a range in these 3 scenarios of 165 to 189,000. And so if we want to take a look at really what does the compliance go, so what do our water levels look like and reflexively to the minimum thresholds that we have, we can see that each of these 5 wells that we currently have in operation, we can see that these 5 wells, the number of years that they're out of compliance. And so indicative of many of the slides prior, we kind of focused in on with this 25 and this 30% demand reduction point. And you can see that these were, this is the number of data points that you saw as that little red dot, really showing us really how many times they're below the minimum threshold. And so, but we don't necessarily need to focus in on specifically on those singular events, but we're really looking at here as the total years of when we're considered out of compliance. And so in this case, based on the simulation and based on the minimum thresholds that we have to date, we can see that both the 25th and the 30th% reduction, we are not out of compliance of at least 3 wells for at least 2 years. Scenario, this 30% demand reduction scenario only has 1 well out of compliance that is very similar to the 25%, but if we utilize the 20% reduction scenario, we actually will jump up to the 3 of those wells being out of compliance. So kind of to summarize really what does a lot of this mean. If you kind of remember, we previously when we went through a very similar table here when we looked at the sustainable yield analysis, and we looked at kind of what is the total available pumping to the subbasin, and then and not necessarily just the group 2 users. And so from here, we can see that based on the 25% demand reduction, which is 0 events when we're out of compliance as a subbasin, we can see that the total pumping afforded to the subbasin is approximately 334,000 acre feet per year. So then the next step, so that's what I'm kind of using as our baseline. We're really looking at, well, what is if it takes the Merced River, the 25% reduction for us to meet our interconnected surface water system on the Merced River, which is kind of where I know a lot of, which I kind of knew in advance where the hardest component would be to hit. Then the next step was to reevaluate the subbasin as a whole under that 25% demand reduction to see, we'll really ask ourselves, does it meet the other SMCs, and does that 25% demand reduction scenario, does that meet all our sustainability goals? So while still focusing on interconnected surface water, but looking at some of the other river systems that we have so I'm gonna take a look real quick. Right now we're looking at the Tuolumne River. You can see we have the 2 wells here. The Tuolumne River actually has a 3rd well here near the city of Modesto, but again, you can kind of see it's a little bit red there. Again, it's another well that is not in place yet, and so we'll be able to add that as soon as that is installed. But at least for now, we only have these 2 wells, East Turlock Subbasin GSA wells 1 and 2, to give us an idea of how we're looking in as far as looking at our SMCs in this area. And so very indicative of similar to the Merced River, we can see that the simulation shows that over the baseline and under scenario 4, we are out of compliance in the 2 drought periods, predominantly the 2 drought periods, but we're also out of compliance a little elsewhere throughout the simulation. But once we implement the demand reduction, we can see our water levels actually improve over time, and we can see that we are never out of compliance at this well. And very similarly, if we look at well 2 here, which is actually the purple here, I apologize that for some reason these are normally highlighted blue and purple. The well 2 is the purple well, and we can see that very similarly we are out of compliance at the very critical points here, but under the 25% demand reduction or under scenario 5, we are within compliance along the Tuolumne River. Similarly, with the on the San Joaquin River, we see there's 3 additional wells here. Just to give us an idea for the sake of these, looking at these 2 wells, we can see that both of these wells are effectively in compliance, or the TID well 111 is in compliance at all times. And though if this one a little bit further to the south here, we see that the baseline and scenario 4 are out of compliance. But when we come to scenario 5, we actually we have 2 years out of compliance here, which does put this specific well out of compliance, but both 111 and then this one that is just south of it. So we do not cross the 50% of wells threshold. Okay, so I know that's a lot, but if we want to effectively, that really gauges or gives us an evaluation of the interconnected surface water criteria as measured by our minimum thresholds and set at our groundwater levels. So if we want to take a pause from that and then take a look at, well, what does the basin look like away from the rivers, right? What is the rest of the, how's the health of the rest of our aquifer system under this scenario? What does it look like? So effectively, if we want to take a look at sustainable management criteria number 1, which is the chronic lowering of groundwater levels, our goal is to evaluate this to not such that look at groundwater levels and ensure that no more than 33% of our representative monitoring wells exceed the 2015 minimum thresholds. So a very similar process as the previous couple of slides that I've shown, but the only caveat now is that we are looking at fall 2015. We need 33% of the representative wells to be exceeding instead of 50%. This is because we have a lot more wells to look at and a lot more greater understanding of the basin. And in this case, in order to be considered out of compliance, we actually need 3 consecutive fall monitoring events rather than 2. So if we want to take a look at some of these wells, I'll come over the next couple of slides. I'm going to kind of pan around the basin. We'll start here in the west and we'll kind of move our way a little bit south and then to the east as well. So if we want to look at these two hydrographs, looking at the projected conditions, we effectively can see that when similarly to some of the operations in the west along the Merced River and along the San Joaquin, we see that that under the drought periods, we do see a large decline in water levels overall, but that predominantly under this scenario, which is demand management in conjunction with the projects, that we stay above our minimum threshold at all times. So the light blue color here. Very similar trend here with well 18. We can look right here above the city of Turlock. Very similar trend where we can see that that in the 25th year and in the 47th year would be out of compliance under the baseline, but under both the projects and this the supply side project and this demand reduction and management action, we can see that the simulation puts us we maintain our water levels above the minimum threshold. Moving a little further south, we see the same thing. We see this is actually a well here, and where this blue well here is actually going to be out of compliance in this under these drought conditions. But again, it comes back to the idea that it requires at least 33% of the wells overall. So we can kind of keep this one in our back pocket, and then acknowledging that it does pop under the minimum threshold line, and we can reevaluate it to make sure that not more of the wells that we don't ever cross that 33 percentile line. Very similar to how the well, we acknowledge that the well along the Merced River is out of compliance, but it does not necessarily put the basin as a whole out of compliance. We see a very similar trend when it comes to TID well 136, which is a little bit further to the east. So then when it comes to some of the wells on the eastern side, this is where we're going to start seeing a lot more variance between the various scenarios, predominantly because this is where a lot of our projects and management actions are going to be focused. Now, this is going to be focused both from scenario 4 when we look at our supply side projects. Again, if you remember, we're bringing about 30,000 acre feet of water overall over across all of our projects. Granted, some of those are going to be focused in on Turlock in series, some of those municipal surface water projects, but we do also have some agricultural projects in both the TID area, right kind of up here in the north, as well as bringing some surface water supply from TID to some of the east side growers. So because of that, we're going to see a little bit of impact from the baseline to scenario 4, and then the bulk of this change is going to be related to this scenario 5 change, which again is that 25% demand reduction scenario. So similarly, from both of these, we can see that we would be out of compliance under either the baseline or under scenario 4. But when it comes to when we implement the management action of the demand reduction, that we make sure that we are above this minimum threshold in both events. Again, looking at a couple more wells, very similar trend. We see as we can acknowledge, very similar operational changes as far as projects and management actions. The fact that we are in compliance under scenario 5, and whereas we would have been out of compliance under the baseline or scenario 4. And then finally, as we get further and further to the east here, this is again where we start seeing operations. We see greater impacts due to a lot of these management actions, but that overall we are fairly well in compliance with our given minimum thresholds. Predominantly, this well here, well 21, can be considered out of compliance for a couple years here, and a couple years again down here. But again, it comes back to the fact that it requires 33% of the wells to be considered out of compliance as a subbasin to kind of trigger the regulatory issues. And again, since we're going to really optimize it, that I really worked to make sure that we really try to pump and we try to utilize our resources the best way we can, kind of really optimizing the operations and allowing some of our wells to be out of compliance in order to optimize our resources while still maintaining the basin in compliance as a whole. Okay, so that's effectively what I have for most of the hydrographs. Now, the last major component to look at is really what are the effects on the water budget as a whole. Predominantly looking at not at change in groundwater storage is considered one of our sustainable management criteria. But in addition to that, it's also just for our benefit from our management and for our standard operations. It's good to know what the impacts that these minimum thresholds that we set is good, what impact they have on a quantitative level to be able to understand what the operations are in the basin and what does our aquifer look like overall. So what you can see here is kind of a quick summary, and again, and I'll dive into it over the next couple of slides here in a much more detailed mean. But the big picture that we can see here are a couple main things that I want to point out. First of all, it's looking at the cumulative change in storage. Now we can see here under the baseline that we were in a net decline overall. Under the scenario 5, which is projects plus management actions, we can see that all these operations, in fact, do relatively quickly. We raise our water levels, we raise our storage overall, and while we allow for fluctuations, for variability in hydrology, overall we can see that we are actually a net positive when compared to the full 50-year simulation period. The other two components that I wanted to make sure we point out is when that are considered sustainable management criteria, but we're not necessarily measuring ourselves directly against, are going to be the stream aquifer interaction, which is going to be related, but not exactly, to our interconnected surface water systems and maintaining that interconnectivity, as well as this bar in the yellow when it comes to our subsurface flow from adjacent areas. Now, for both of these, we can see that under the baseline conditions, we were dependent on pulling water from the river system to shore up our change in storage, to shore up our groundwater levels. We were pulling large volumes of water out of the river system. And in addition to that, we also were pulling large volumes of water from our neighboring subbasins, and it's the kind of the culmination of those that we're really targeting to make sure that we are either, in this case, we have our river system. We actually revert, similar to the historical, we revert back to being a net giver to the stream system, as well as doing our very best to mitigate how much groundwater we are stealing from our neighbors within the aquifer through subsurface flow. And so you can see we get a lot closer to a kind of a net even when it comes to the subsurface flow, and we become a contributor again to the stream and to the overall stream system. So to kind of break each of those into kind of their more distinct categories, the first thing I want to do is I want to show their change in groundwater storage. We know we had a lot of discussion when we went through this in scenario 4. Predominantly, we can see here that we moved from this generally our storage being overall a strong declining change in storage under the baseline, which is shown in this black line, to once we implemented a lot of our supply side projects, we see that scenario 4 we can see a lot of improvement from that. And that is indicative of this kind of this light blue line. And then again, if we build on top of that some of the demand reduction items that we have outlined, we can see that overall our change in storage, again, continues to improve over the 50-year period. On the other hand, when it comes to interconnected surface water, so effectively what I have here is a comparison looking at the Tuolumne, the San Joaquin, and the Merced River, comparing some of the different scenarios we have. So on each of these charts, you'll see there's 4 bars. Each of these 4 bars are indicative of effectively how the aquifer system views the stream system under each of these conditions. So these are average values over the full simulation period for each of these. So it's 25 years in the historical and 50 years for each of the baseline, scenario 4 and scenario 5. When it comes to each of these simulations, you'll see that since this is from the groundwater's perspective, you'll see that a negative value here is indicative of the aquifer system discharging water to the river, as opposed to the darker colors on the top being the stream system or the groundwater system pulling water from the stream system. So that's gonna be a stream seepage. So that's gonna be water entering the groundwater system. And effectively, even though these aren't necessarily directly implemented as far as our sustainability criteria, it is important for us to understand what these mean operationally. So what you can see here, predominantly when it comes to the Tuolumne River, you can see that we in the historical have been a strongly net giving water from the groundwater system to the Tuolumne River system under the historical conditions. But under the baseline, we kind of flipped that relationship. We actually started pulling more and more water out of the Tuolumne River. Now that is it. When it comes to scenarios 4 and scenario 5, and particularly scenario 5, our goal is to somewhat mitigate that dependence on stream seepage. And whereas our goal is not necessarily to target to replicate the historical trends, but at least to mitigate as much of the impacts that we're having under the projected conditions baseline. So we can see that under scenario 5, we start again becoming a net giver to the aquifer system in the Tuolumne River. I'll skip the San Joaquin River real quick right now, but when it comes to the Merced River, we kind of see a very similar trend. Under the historical conditions, we were actually the Merced River is a net seeping river, a net giving river to the aquifer system, but we're looking at the overall magnitude is about a little under 20,000 acre-feet per year. Under the baseline conditions, because we've continued to lower our groundwaters, we can continue to induce additional river water. That dependence on the river system, that river seepage increased dramatically to about 60,000 acre-feet. And by utilizing the minimum thresholds that we have set for our groundwater levels and at those minimum thresholds at the spring of 2014 water levels, and our goals as far as our ability to achieve that is predominantly here when it comes to scenario 5, you can see that we are at least mitigating that to some degree. We're looking at about 35,000 acre-feet of stream seepage rather than of the full 60,000. And then now if I can really quick return to the San Joaquin, we can see a kind of a very similar trend to the two, whereas we're much closer to the historical as comparatively to the baseline. We start seeing ourselves being net givers to the river system. But the only other caveat that I wanted to add for the San Joaquin River is because of the relationship of the Merced River and the amount of seepage in the Merced River, there's actually kind of a feedback loop that we see when it comes to the interaction between the stream system and the aquifer system for the San Joaquin. Because we are not pulling as much water out of the Merced River, the San Joaquin River actually has more water in it, which means the stage levels are rising. And so because of that, even though water levels continue to rise under the sustainability simulation of scenario 5, we see river water also the stage in the river also rise. And so because of that, we don't have a direct impact that we see in the other two, but rather a kind of a mixed relationship where we see more water being discharged to the river, but we also see a little bit more water being pulled from the river as well. So the overall balance though shows us as in generally in sustainability. Okay, so if we want to take a look at the overall land and water use budget, again, this is a water use budget. This shows us operationally what our greatest impacts are. And so this is where the vast bulk of the information is, but I do want to draw your attention, similarly to the previous presentation, I want to draw the bulk of your attention to the last two columns. So effectively what we have here though is the projected condition baselines, and we have the standard operations under these baselines, or under the baseline. Comparatively to that, we also have what I consider the sustainable yield conditions. Now, this is the demand reduction analysis that we did prior to implementing all the projects and management actions. And what you can see here overall is that in order to be sustainable with no projects, it required an overall demand reduction of approximately 100,000 acre feet. And that we can actually see that predominantly being both in the agricultural sector. We see about 100,000 acre feet of demand reduction, 100,000 acre feet of private groundwater pumping. And then we also see a reduction in our overall urban use as well of over approximately another 13,000 acre feet or so. We see that demand reduction and that indicative of that reduction in pumping as well, right? So our goal of that, moving from these two simulations into scenario 4 and eventually scenario 5, is to really mitigate that the amount of demand reduction necessary to achieve sustainability. So that's where all of our projects and management actions have really been focused on so far. And so because of that, you'll see a lot of the things that we went over in some of the previous previous TAC meetings. You can see the SRWA project, as well as bringing surface water to Hickman, of 17,600 acre feet. We see that bring that additional surface water being brought to our urban users. We see that to help mitigate the groundwater production necessary to operate in an urban setting. So we see this impact from our projects. In addition to that, we also see a lot of the other projects that we have from the agricultural sector, as far as increasing some of our surface water deliveries, bringing some of the municipal offset pumping again as part of that urban project. We're bringing recycled water from the city of Turlock into the west, and overall reducing our overall private pumping. And in addition to that, we also have a lot of in addition to that, in addition to our water use components, I also have these two components down here, which are related, I'm leaving as an other category, but they are directly related to our operations. And this is going to be focused in on the approximate 9,000 acre feet of direct recharge from our direct recharge projects related to scenario 4. And again, these are all just supply side projects, supply side efforts to help mitigate the need to reduce our overall demand. And so we have been working with both of the GSAs and a lot of the agencies within the Subbasin to try to do our very best to come up with ideas and implementable actions to mitigate the overall demand reduction necessary. But if we want to look at directly into scenario 5, right, which is projects plus this idea of 25% demand reduction, what we can see here, kind of if comparatively to not only the baseline scenario 4, is what we can see is that our overall demand reduction, instead of the 100,000 acre feet that we saw under sustainable yield simulation, we can see that now is about 60,000 acre feet of demand reduction. You can see here so we pull that 781 down to 720,000 acre feet, which is about 61,300 acre feet per year of demand reduction required to achieve our sustainability goals. Indicative of this generalized demand reduction, we're going to see that a reduction in our private groundwater pumping. We see that reduction of 290,000 acre feet down to 224,000 acre feet, or roughly almost 225,000 acre feet. And similarly to the 61,000, again, we're going to look at here, we're going to see this is about 65,000. The difference between the two of these are going to be, again, focused on our impacts to scenario 4. But if we just want to look at some of the, so we're looking at about 61,000 acre feet indicative of our demand reduction, and then about that 4,000 or so acre feet related to some of our in lieu recharge projects. And so this is the kind of the volume effectively that it requires from a water use perspective to achieve our sustainability goals. And so what does that mean for the groundwater budget? So similar to the previous slide, I kind of, again, broke everything down. But if I want to bring at least your immediate attention to the impacts, and we'll kind of get into the exact numbers in a second, but if we want to bring your attention to the impacts, this is where we would expect to see the direct translation from our water use budget into our groundwater budget and be able to quantify really what do those impacts mean from the other components. So our direct impacts are predominantly going to be focused in on related to deep percolation, canal and reservoir recharge, and our groundwater pumping. And so groundwater pumping is going to be indicative exactly of the previous slide. We have less agricultural pumping and less urban pumping due to demand reduction. We have a less groundwater pumping due to some of the projects. So again, we're looking at about 65,000 of that being agriculturally related, and then at about just under 17,000 or so being on kind of the urban side of things. And so that overall groundwater production is related to this 82,900 acre feet per year. The other direct impacts we have as far as our surface operations are going to be this 9,400 acre feet of canal and reservoir recharge. Again, this is going to be indicative of our scenario 4 projects or direct recharge projects. And so we can see the great impact from the baseline to scenario 4. We see so we have about 10,000 acre feet of additional recharge there. And then it also kind of indicative of the demand reduction scenario, because we are effectively pulling acreage out of production, because we're applying less water and there's an irrigation efficiency applied to any on-farm irrigation methodology. We're seeing reduced deep percolation from reducing that applied water of about 4,500 acre feet per year. And that's going to be most heavily focused towards our demand reduction, although it does affect the some of our scenario 4 projects as well, but this is mostly demand reduction. So those are our direct impacts. Really, the next question is to what happens to our indirect impacts, and those are going to be related to stream seepage, subsurface flow, and our overall groundwater storage. Now, I kind of showed you some graphics related to stream seepage overall, but by setting minimum thresholds to protect the interconnected surface water systems surrounding the Turlock Subbasin, we can see that overall, under the baseline, we were extracting about 36,900 acre feet of water under the baseline conditions, and then under scenario 4, kind of effectively with all of our projects, we were able to reduce that by approximately 10,000 acre feet per year. And then through implementation of our demand reduction projects, we were able to additionally pull an additional, bring that down to 18,000 acre feet of net discharge to the river system, bringing the overall impact of about 55,000 acre feet per year. Now, also when it comes to our net subsurface flow of adjacent subbasins, this is the other component. This is that yellow bar on the previous slide that I mentioned. The goal of this is not necessarily, we don't necessarily have a direct minimum threshold or a direct management action associated with this, but rather it's kind of an indirect resultant of a lot of our actions that we've taken. So, and overall, it's fairly beneficial to not effectively pull groundwater from our adjacent subbasins. So in the baseline, we see about where we were effectively pulling a subsurface flow of about 30,000 acre feet from our neighboring subbasins. Under sustainable yield, we actually got that down to about 2,000, but again, the sustainable yield was a little bit different of a beast, both spatially and volumetrically. But through looking at our projects, we were able to reduce by about 15,000 acre feet and increase that through our supply side projects and demand reduction. We can bring that overall net subsurface inflow into our system down to about 14,900 acre feet. And so really what that means is that overall we're importing about 14,000 acre feet less water from our neighboring subbasins. The impact of all of that, effectively the accumulation of all that, goes to what is our groundwater storage. And so what you can see that under the baseline, we were actually declining, because this is a groundwater storage deficit. So we were declining our groundwater storage, declining our water levels by about 5,500 acre feet per year. Under sustainable yield, we were seeing about 13,000 acre feet change in storage is what it would take to meet our minimum thresholds without our projects. And then by implementing both our projects and our demand reduction in the simulation, we were able to bring that to approximately 13,100 acre feet per year of water that is actually increasing in our groundwater levels and increasing in our overall storage, bringing the total impact of our projects to about 18,000 acre feet. So I know that's a lot of numbers, but really kind of like the goal of this is to look at, if we look at the inputs into this, we can see that the overall, we see about 80,000 or a little 83,000 acre feet of pumping impact, and we see about 10,000 acre feet of pumping, of recharge as an impact. And so we can see kind of the culmination of our direct impacts is we see about 90,000 acre feet through both of our supply side projects and our demand reduction. So we can look at about 90,000 acre feet there, and really the idea of where does that go? Well, about 20,000 of that stays in the aquifer system. About 55,000 of that is going to achieving our sustainability goals, achieving the sigma metric of interconnected surface water, and shoring up and protecting that system. And also we see about 14,000 of that being that we're pulling less water in from our neighboring subbasins.
Dominic?
Debbie, did you have, yep.
Yeah. Should the groundwater pumping impact number, the 82,900, be a negative number? Because it's supposed to be this scenario.
Yes. Hmm?
Okay.
Correct. Yes, it should be.
Okay. And the other question for you, and I didn't want to interrupt you, you were on a roll earlier. And I just want to make sure that the slides that we end up posting on the site are correct. There was one other thing. If you scroll back to the first set of hydrographs that you showed, I think there might be something left over from earlier. Yeah, the note at the bottom, below threshold is evaluated using the 30% reduction. Is that supposed to be 25?
Yeah, so effectively we looked at the red dots here actually are still showing the 30% because we actually have very similar 25 and 30% show very similar results as far as when we are out of compliance. It's only when we lower to 20% that we start seeing more of these dots kind of pop up.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because you were talking 25, but then it said 30. So I wanted to make sure everybody was on the same page. Perfect.
Thank you for that clarification. Okay. So effectively, what does all that mean? I know I just threw a ton of information at you. The short version of all this is that is really focusing, I guess, on these kind of three numbers. Is effectively under sustainable yield, which is our first draft, our first cut at what would it take for this basin to meet all of our sustainability goals. The sustainable yield analysis with no projects, the target that we hit for that is approximately 311,000 acre feet per year. When we implement a lot of our supply side projects, we're looking at, we came up with approximately 33,000 acre feet of contributions. And so effectively, we're kind of effectively building on that 311,000, right? The goal is we're trying to mitigate that reduction as much as possible and allow us to pump in this subbasin as much as possible while still achieving our sustainability goals. By then taking a look at our sustainable management, right? So now once we have the projects in place, how much water can we pump regularly and still see our still meet our sustainability goals? We can see that number increases to about 334,000 acre feet per year. Now I do want to, I'm sure someone will very quickly point out that 311 plus 33 is not 334. And this is really what is related because of due to the inefficiencies, both spatially and temporally related to a lot of our projects. And so if you remember when we went over a lot of our projects, honestly, a lot of our projects that we come are actually really more targeted towards kind of a northern part of our basin, right? We have the SRWA project when it comes to our urban users, which is in the center of city of Turlock, which is in the center of the basin, but also the city of Ceres, kind of on our northern boundary, as well as a lot of the recharge projects that we have available to us are kind of limited in scope to the northern half of our sub-basin. And so because of that, we don't have a kind of a direct one-to-one relationship. And so I just want to make sure that I kind of clarified that, is that there's always going to be inefficiencies in our projects because we do not, or they're not perfectly optimized. But this is where we are, this is a good step as to where we are today. And so our goal is obviously to help increase this 334 over time, to take another, to take looks as we move forward into implementation of the GSP over the next many years, to develop additional supply side projects, to different levels of optimization that we can to really do our best to really optimize and maximize the amount of groundwater production that we can provide in this basin without going below any of our given minimum thresholds. And then so I know I see a lot of questions popping up in the chat, so I'll get to those in 1 second, but real quick, let me wrap up this slide. Really, I just wanted to make sure I reiterate some of the words that kind of Ali went through at the beginning of this. But really is that the goal is that I acknowledge that this is a working model. This is a working document. Our GSP is a working document. And we do have this idea of adaptive management. We're going to do our very best to really optimize all these things as data improves, as our understanding of the basin improves. But as it stands right now, we understand that the model really does look at the best available data that we have and that we've been able to accumulate to accurately estimate the level of sustainability conditions. And really our goal is to provide data, provide quantifications to really support the GSAs, to support your policymakers in order to set those goals that they have. In addition to that, I also want to make a point to acknowledge that there are a lot of uncertainties in the model, and that some of these data gaps, our goal is to address them, and that we have a lot more data now than we did even 2, 3, 5 years ago. And so because of that, as we continue to gather data, as we continue to fill in those gaps, we're hoping to be able to narrow down our optimization and be able to understand the basin even better, potentially for an annual update or potentially even at the full 5-year update. We hope to be able to effectively revisit a lot of this and hopefully improve the situation as we can represent it. And so, and as I mentioned a second ago, we do have, this isn't a living document. This is, we do have adaptive management built into it. This isn't really the the final thing that will live for the next 50 years. And that really we are presenting here as a flexible strategy that we can refine as we move forward and as data becomes further available. So I'm just going to make sure real quick. Yep, that's the end of my presentation. So with that, I can either open it up for any questions from people on the line, or I can actually go back through the chat. I saw things were popping up, but I'm not quite sure if any of those were already addressed or not.
Don't worry about the chat ones, Dominic. I think I addressed most of them. I know Mike Titza's got a few comments that he'd like to make verbally, so I invite Mike to do that. But before we do that, I just wanted to make sure that I know Sprague had a comment on the budgets and what is the bottom line, so to speak. So let me just maybe in a couple of statements, just make, maybe lay out the bottom line. I think the bottom line is that the basin is currently in the overdraft conditions. The bottom line is that the basin is projected to stay in overdraft conditions. However, in order to bring the basin into balance and in a sustainable condition, we need to have both supply side and demand side projects. We've laid out supply side projects that are conceivable and have been planned. And so we're going to include those in projects and management actions chapter of the GSP and lay out a schedule for implementation of those supply side projects, be it design of these projects, implementation, and so on and so forth. And there's been a lot of discussions between the two GSAs, as well as between the East Side Water District and Merced ID in terms of water supply availability for these projects and so on and so forth. So those are all going to be documented. Short of all of those supply side projects, we are estimating, based on all of the analysis that's been done and all of the uncertainties and all of the sensitivity analysis, that there is approximately additional 25% groundwater pumping that needs to be reduced on the east side in order to bring the basin into sustainable condition per the GSP requirements. And so we're going to have a schedule, and we're going to go around and look at sort of the path to sustainability on what that potentially means. But that is all going to be refined over the next few years also, as we gain more understanding and more knowledge on the basin and we get more data. And in fact, if there are more supply side projects that are developed over the course of the next few years, those would basically chop off certain percentages for that demand reduction. So with that, I'll invite Mike Titza maybe to help out in here. And Michael, I'm going to pass it on to you if you'd like to moderate the rest of this, please.
Thanks, Elliot. Good segue, Mike. Titza, coordinator for the East Turlock GSA. Want to go ahead there?
Sure. I just want to make just a couple of comments and then let Ali and Dominique react. And my intention there is that the model is a really important tool, and I agree it's based on what currently is our best available information. It's currently our best available tool. Is it perfect? No. And it's probably not going to be perfect, probably ever, but it'll get better over time. The decisions that we're asking to be supported by the model are really important ones. And so that's why I want to bring up these points. So the first is just kind of revisiting uncertainty. The demand reduction analysis as it is relies on comparing absolute predicted groundwater levels to minimum thresholds. And so it's doing what we said was probably the most uncertain use of the model. Now, I wouldn't dismiss the findings as a result of that, but my impression is that, we don't know that it's 25%. 25% is, if our analysis is correct, then it's 25%. So heads up, that's quite a bit. But could it be less? Yes. Could it be more? Yes. So that's point number one. Point number two, that demand reduction scenario, as I understand it, is a net value. Okay, so I've heard several times folks say that means 25% pumping reduction. Whatever percentage it is, it's a net value. So, we would want to work hard to bring as many projects to the table as we can, so that doesn't have to be, so that amount can be lessened to the extent that it's able to be lessened. And we currently have group 3 projects in the GSP that were not modeled because they're not yet far enough along in the planning process to warrant actually putting numbers on them. They're just not that far along.
Call from STEM Not Lab.
So that's the second point, is that it's a net value. And then my third and final point is that, okay, all that aside, I think using the model to assess that we have a big hole to climb out of, it is a fair assessment. I mean, I think that's the model results are a pretty solid indicator that in order to make the basin whole, that not only do we need more planned projects, but it seems likely that we will need, or let me maybe not equivocate on that, but what the result is telling us is that we likely need more projects and demand reduction. And I think that putting all of our eggs in the basket of future projects seems unwise, but the extent to which they can be balanced is an adaptive management exercise so that it hits the target properly as more data become available. So those are my 3 points, and I'll go ahead and turn off my mic and let you react to them.
Sure, if I may, please, Michael. So great points, Mike. I appreciate that. I think that the first point in terms of comparing the absolute groundwater level predictions to the minimum threshold, I think it's a very subtle matter, because what we have compared against is that differential from the baseline groundwater levels to what the demand reduction or the scenario scale groundwater levels are going to look like. So we are still looking at a change and a rise in groundwater levels at these hydrographs, not necessarily an absolute level, but those are details that we could probably go back and forth and maybe check against each other's, perceptions and perspectives on how that should be implemented. Having said that, I fully agree with you on the other 2 points, that the demand reduction is net. Of course, the more water is brought into the basin and the more projects are implemented, the less demand reduction is needed. Is there enough water? to bring into the basin to completely bring the project into sustainable condition. At this point, based on all the data, all the indications, no. So what that means is, yeah, it's going to have to be a combination of both project side as well as demand reduction. And that balance needs to be very delicately worked on so that the schedule of the implementation of the GSP is not thrown off. At the same time, there is some level of commitment both within the GSA as well as by the Subbasin to the DWR at the level that DWR would check that box and say, hey guys, you guys know what you're doing. We're okay with your GSP and we're good with it. So we don't want to leave this too ambiguous. So DWR come back and start questioning our either motives and or our schedule of implementation. So we're kind of walking a delicate line in here. And we need to all work together to make sure that we have the right language, but also the right level of commitment, please.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think, with respect to one, I think we're still looking at an absolute level, but we can talk about that. I don't think it changes the other two conclusions, which is that the model indicates that there's an issue. I just want to be sure that folks understand that we can't say today that X number of acres need to be taken out of production or X amount of irrigation efficiency needs to be achieved. I think what we've got is we've got a context for developing an adaptive management program that allows us to implement what needs to be implemented, projects to the extent that we can, and demand reduction to the extent that we must, as the monitoring data make us aware.
Yeah, I'm fine with that, Mike. Yes.
Thanks, Mike, for the question, Ali, for the clarification. Kind of like the slide up on the screen says right now, compliance is evaluated through observed data, not by the model, right? So we got 2 or 3 dials to turn, and we turn them in different directions at different rates and see what impact that has on the basin, on water levels, and we adjust from there over time. Any questions we didn't get to through the chat or here verbally? That's a lot of stuff to take in. And Ali and Dominic, thank you for distilling down a complicated project or complicated concept. This is kind of for many people, this is where the rubber meets the road on Sigma.
Hey, Michael, Kevin Kaufman here. I have a question for Ali. Ali, you just said a couple minutes ago that there's not enough water. That's the first I've heard anybody say that. What are you using as a basis to say there wouldn't be enough water to come up with the projects to reduce the demand reduction side, ultimately to zero? I mean, that would be my goal. Is I've always calculated there's plenty of water to, if we develop enough projects, to bring that number down. I don't have any objection with demand reduction being part of the GSP, but I certainly would object to that type of statement, that answering the question, is there enough water? And you say no. I'm wondering what your basis is there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Well, maybe I should qualify what I meant by that. Volume-wise, throughout the entire basin, there's probably enough water to bring the basin into sustainability, although I have not made that calculation, honestly. So I'm going to reserve the judgment on that. But what I meant was, areas that we have overdraft conditions right now and areas that we are focusing the demand reduction on, based on what we know today on October 4th, and all of the conversations that have been going on to date in terms of how much water can be dedicated to these projects, there's not enough water to sort of tilt the bucket on the demand reduction significantly. If there's going to be additional water down the road that folks are going to move around within the basin or from outside the basin, yeah, there's probably water. But at this stage, on October 4th, to the extent that we have data, information, agreements, and sort of that's all I meant.
Fair enough. Thank you for that clarification.
All right, anybody else on this topic? Okay, so Ali, Dominic, what happens next? We incorporate this information into the draft chapter that ultimately gets released, or maybe it's a question for Phyllis.
No, that's yeah, and I'll let Phyllis also maybe expand on this. But currently on our plate is to take all of these, including the comments that we received to date, and synthesize and summarize these into the what's called the projects and management actions chapter of the GSP. We've already sent on portions of that for the ad hoc committee to review, and we're looking for feedback on some of that. We're going to complete that chapter and eventually release that for review. I will have to get back to you folks on the schedule on exactly when that would be available. Beyond that, there's an implementation chapter for the GSP. Some of the items that we've talked about today are going to make their way into the implementation chapter of the GSP, meaning schedule, potential funding sources, cost of implementation, and so on and so forth for the GSP to be implemented over the next 5 years. I'm assuming Phyllis has got more thoughts on that.
I don't know if I can add to that. That sounds exactly like what we're doing. We have some additional chapters that are coming out very soon. We have TAC comments on the sustainable management criteria and monitoring networks chapters. And they are, those comments are being incorporated into them now and should be released sometime in the next few weeks. So a lot's happening and a lot is in the works for additional GSP chapters.
Thank you, Phyllis. Okay, with that, say we move on to item number 7, Sigma related updates. This is where the technical advisory committee members discuss and provide updates on issues related to Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. We have our usual 3 things there. Communications outreach, the schedule, and grants. So Herb, are you up for a communications or outreach update?
Yeah, Michael, thanks. I just have a quick update today. Just first and foremost, reminding everybody and encouraging them to tell others to visit our GSP page on turlockgroundwater.org/GSP. There, I'll note to this group that we, as soon as we receive them, we are posting comments online. The people who've commented on the GSP and agencies who commented on the GSP. So just encourage people to go there. We continue to work on the notice and communication chapter 3 of the draft GSP, and should be getting some headway on that, hopefully by the end of this month, early next month. Also at the end of October is our next tentative groundwater lunch hour, our virtual lunch hours. We're eyeing an October 28th date, so prepare to hear more about that. And then lastly, as we get closer toward the beginning of November, the first couple of weeks in November, we're starting to talk about having some deep dives as far as outreach and communication into the more detailed topics in the GSP, draft GSP chapters. And so stay tuned for those, and you'll hear more about those as long as the schedule holds its current pace. But that's it for me, barring questions or comments.
Any questions or comments for Herb? Okay, hearing none. Debbie.
Thank you, Michael. So I do have some updates, although Phyllis and Ali kind of talked a little bit about some of the next steps for the GSP effort. Phyllis is actively updating the sustainable management criteria and the monitoring network chapters, which are the next chapters to be considered and removed and reviewed by the GSAs for in consideration for releasing them to the public. And as you've seen in the last, I guess, couple of technical advisory committee meetings, there have been some modifications and comments to those chapters, and so she's actively working through those revisions, and we want to get it out to the TAC for initial review to make sure everybody's seen it before it goes to the GSAs. So we hope to have that out for the TAC's internal review this week. So be prepared, and we'll need a quick review. The chapter sections, those areas that have been changed due to comments and will be highlighted. So you can have a focused review. And we were also reaching out to the boards to schedule another joint GSA meeting for the review and release of those chapters. Right now, we're focusing on October 14th, but stay tuned. It isn't set in stone yet. So just wanted to give everybody a kind of a heads up. We're also finalizing the other chapters as they indicated, including the communication and outreach chapter that's actively being worked on as well. As Herb mentioned, we are receiving comments and they are being posted on our website. We're also reaching out to DWR and working with the consultants that we've been working with for the FSS funding or assistance we've gotten from DWR to see if we are able to make use of some of their expertise to help facilitate the coordination of the responses to comments, because that'll kind of keep us on track. We haven't heard back yet, but we will report back later as we continue to pursue that. So that's all I have on the GSP at this time. I'm hoping to have a more complete schedule for you folks at our next meeting, which is a special meeting, I think, on the 14th. So I'll stop and answer any questions if there are any, and then I'll move into the grant.
Any questions for Debbie on the schedule? Okay, Debbie, go proceed with the grant.
Great. So as you know, we have a second grant to work on developing a programmatic EIR, monitoring wells, and the groundwater recharge assessment tool. And each of those projects are continuing to move forward. At the last TAC, we established an ad hoc committee for the PEIR. We are actively reaching out to see who wants to be engaged in that. And so you should be seeing an email here this week. So please respond to that, because we'd like to compile that list and get that process started as soon as possible. The monitoring wells, there have been some issues that we're working through in obtaining the permits to install the wells. A couple had to be relocated, or we're reaching out to the county for an exception to work through that process. And so we're hoping that we'll have those in hand very soon, and then we'll be able to move forward. I believe that we'll have to provide an extension to the drilling contractor at this point, because it's just taken a little longer than we had initially anticipated to get the permits in place. But I do appreciate all the help from everyone, the consultant team, and Kevin and Mike and everyone in working through that process, because it has not been easy. And lastly, the groundwater recharge assessment tool, or the GRAT. The team developing that are finishing up their work. I have a meeting with them later this week, and I hope to have a more refined release date on when we'll have that finished up when we meet next. So I'd be happy to answer any questions on all of that either. Also,
Debbie, have a friendly reminder, the programmatic EIR subgroup.
yes.
Do we have people?
No, that's what I was saying, that
Right.
you're gonna get an email, or the TAC will get an email asking for people to participate in that process. And we're trying to come up with that list of who is willing to serve on the ad hoc committee for the TAC in developing the PEIR. Sorry if I wasn't clear.
No, sorry, it's my bad. Thank you.
And Debbie, I have an update if it's okay.
Sure.
Oh, thank you. I just got an email 15 minutes ago from Merced County. They issued permits for both of those wells.
Fabulous.
Fantastic.
We've
Thank
got
you.
permits in hand. That's good news. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks Kevin and Debbie for your hard work on that. It's good to get more data points. Is always going to be good. Okay, anything else Sigma related updates?
Not for me.
Okay, so with that, our next special meeting is Thursday, October 14th. So back to Thursdays. And next regular meeting is October 28th. Those will both be via teleconference because we passed that resolution today. So see you all back here. Those next two meetings in October via teleconference. And with that, I'll take a motion for adjournment from the West Turlock Subbasin Technical Advisory Committee. We have a motion for adjournment.
Aaron will motion to adjourn.
Aaron from Series motion to adjourn. Do we have a second?
Miguel, City Modesto.
Modesto second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 West Turlock is adjourned. Sarah, over to you.
On the East Turlock, can I get a motion to adjourn?
Yeah, so moved, Walt.
Thank you, Walt. In a second.
Second, Lacey.
Thanks, Lacey. I'll do a quick roll call. Walt.
Yes.
Ward. Lacey McBride. Lacey, did you vote in
Yes.
favor? Thank you.
Yeah.
Matt Beeman
Yes.
and Sarah Wolf, yes. We are adjourned.